Gwetsi se hopa hin wakanime asa watyats kutitime osuta. My name is A-dae Romero-Briones. I'm Coachiti in Kiowa. And what about that thunderstorm last night? Wasn't that amazing? I was a little thrown off by all the sirens, but it was beautiful nonetheless. And before I get started, this is the first session in the morning. It's always the hardest. I want to get our juices flowing. So if you just bear with me for a second, if you all stand up and you turn to the person next to you, first say good morning. And now I want you to look at that person and I want you to, without words, demonstrate sadness. Okay, I hear a few giggles. Now I want you to demonstrate anger. Okay. Now I want you to demonstrate joy. I want you to demonstrate happiness. Okay, thank you. That wasn't too hard. Thank you, thank you. Thank you for indulging me. So there's a couple really important behaviors that you'll notice when we did that exercise. One, if we want to be in our happy space, in our joy space, you see a lot of movement. You see no movement when you're mad or you're sad. So movement is a really important thing for humans and for us to recognize when we're in our happy spaces. And I equate movement not just with physical movement, but mental movement and movement in conversations. So when we're talking about equity, when we're talking about food justice, it's really important to question and to realize when we're not moving in the conversations. And I began this introducing my tribe, Coachiti and Kiowa, and before I get started, it's always practice that when an indigenous person is walking into the territory of another indigenous community, you recognize those people. So the Dakota and the Anishinaabe, this is their homelands. And in traditional times, if my people came to this place, we would present ourselves, present our intentions, because in old days, if you didn't do that, that was actually a sign of war and malice. And so it's really important that we do that today. I only have like 10 minutes left, so let me get started. I'm Coachiti in Kiowa. And being Coachiti in Kiowa means that Coachiti have been agriculturalists in the Southwest for generations, for millennia. We say time immemorial. Kiowa people followed the buffalo. We lived in teepees, we were in the southern plains, and we've practiced these traditional food systems in the past, before colonization, during colonization, and presently, all up against the story of the American food system. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about that story. But I say that because in these stories, up against the American food system, let's think about what the American food system story is. And it goes a little something like this. The farmer worked really hard to subdue wildlands to feed the nation. Or something like this. The farmer works really, really hard to feed their family, to feed their community, and to feed a nation. Or something like this. The farmer, this is more of the present narrative, the farmer works really hard to get food to a distribution center, to get it to institutions that then feeds the nation. And I tell you that narrative because it matters how we tell the story, who tells the story, because it frames the way we see the problem. And so I work at First Nations Development Institute, where I work with over 500 tribally led, indigenous-led nonprofits on their food and agricultural projects. We're intermediary, which means we get money from larger foundations and we distribute it to smaller foundations, smaller organizations, smaller tribal nonprofits. And when we, before pre-pandemic, before COVID, one of the issues we faced at First Nations was that foundations were coming to us and saying, we really want to support Indigenous food systems. So we're going to give you money, but we want to see the economic benefits to the community. We want to give you money, but we want to see nutritional impacts. We want to see improvements. We want to give you money, but you have to tell us how the economy is changing. And so it was really frustrating for a lot of our tribal projects because we were already being inserted to a narrative that wasn't ours. And so we started a project where we asked our grantees, our tribal communities, what is the difference between an Indigenous food system and a mainstream food system? And what is an Indigenous food system? And so I'm going to share some of that with you today. Can you slide, please? Next, please. Okay. So what is the difference between an Indigenous food system and a mainstream food system? Well, the main difference, and I hope you see that big bar across the mainstream food system where you see the dollar signs. Well, of course, before I even get started about the differences, let's talk about the similarities. One, food is central, right? Food is central. Our institutions that support the food are essential, and our resources are essential. But the difference is that you can monetize and commodify our collective resources that support the institutions that support our foods. And in an Indigenous food system, collective resources such as land, energy, water, and health, community health, are not monetized. You cannot monetize those, and you cannot put a dollar sign on it, which means that the community has to have a different set of values in order to manage those things, because it comes a lot harder when your unit of measure is not money. And in order to access food in the mainstream food system, essentially you need money. I'm a food and agriculture attorney, so there's Good Samaritan laws, but that's a whole nother discussion for another day. But money is essentially how you access not only institutions, how you access food, how you determine whether that food system is successful. In an Indigenous food system, we rely on collective management, so the community values are essential in that you have to be able to be part of a community that then has cultural values and mechanisms for the community to actually recognize when somebody is hungry, when somebody is not getting food. And in order to do that, the community has to be able to respond and recognize when that's happening. And when that happens in an Indigenous food system, you have to change up the institution in order to create the access that is needed. You need to figure out what is wrong in that system, and you need to fix it. However, in a mainstream food system, all we really know when someone is hungry is that they don't have the monetary resources to actually access that food. That's like the shortest description I've ever given, so we'll go to the next question. What is an Indigenous food system? And so yes, next please. Okay, so what is an Indigenous food system? And we start here. Of course, I know we're at the Food Waste Conference, so we'll get to the waste square before I end. But we start at land, fire, seeds, and water. And in an Indigenous food system, you need to access all of those things to actually even start thinking about a food system. You need healthy plants and animals. And then we get to human beings, where you need the hunters and harvesters to actually understand what's happening with land, seeds, water, plants, and animals. And this is a whole quarter of our food system before we even get to farmers and ranchers and growers. And so the indigenous food system, the indigenous narrative, starts in a whole other place. It starts way before we get to the farmer. And so when we realize that who tells the story, how we tell the story, frames how we see the problem, it really has meaning for indigenous people, because when we're thinking about the story starting at the farmer, we're already missing half of our story about the food system. And I'm not going to bore you with going through the rest of the food system, except I want to look at the processors and cooks. You know, and the processors word comes from like the mainstream food system. And when we asked our grantees, well, who are your processors in your food system? They said, huh? What is a processor? What are you talking about? And so we had to delve really deep into what that was. And most of them said, oh, you mean cooks. You mean the people who actually like can make something of the food we grow or the animals we hunt or manage. And that was a really important lesson. And then when you get to the bottom half, where you see retail, food entrepreneurs, farmers markets, institutional kitchens, that is the more recent developments. But essentially, that's where a lot of the food system, American mainstream food system conversations are happening. And so we're missing this whole 3/4 of our cycle when we're talking about just the institutional structures in mainstream American food systems. And then we have tribal law and government, but let's talk about waste really quickly. So waste was a really important concept, because when we asked our grantees, how do you feel about waste? Again, they said, huh? If we're doing this right, we should have zero waste. And the waste is an indicator of a malfunctioning system in an indigenous community. If you have any waste at the end of this cycle, something is wrong. Something in this cycle is off, and we have to fix it. In a mainstream food system, waste is just a byproduct. Waste is part of the essential conversation equation, essential part of the conversation. And so in that, waste is a very different concept when it comes to indigenous food systems. Next. Okay, you can just shut off the slides. It's too early to have words on a screen to read, so I won't bore you with that. And so when we talk about indigenous food systems, we talk about American food systems, it's really important to listen to who's telling the story. And if we don't have indigenous people in the room telling their own story about their own food system or their experience in the American food system, we are missing 3/4 of the conversation. And that not only goes for indigenous people, that goes for Black people, that goes for immigrant farmers, that goes for Asian people. If we're only having conversations with the majority white community about the modern American food system that begins with the farmer, we are missing a whole lot of conversation. What matters is how we tell the story, who tells the story, because it frames the way we see the problem.